The Taiwan Strait is one of the most important choke points in the world, and if war between China and Taiwan broke out, it's not just these two countries, or the surrounding ones, or the broader region that would be affected, but the entire world. The Taiwan issue is a global issue, so let's understand how each country in the world would react to an invasion of Taiwan. Japan is one of the closest and likely first country to get involved militarily. Tokyo has said that a Chinese attack on Taiwan could be considered an existential threat to Japan's security. Japan hosts major US bases which would be critical to win the war. It's likely that the Chinese will attack these bases given that their success in Taiwan will largely be determined on how fast they can capture the island before US and Japanese ships arrive and destroy their amphibious fleet. In this likely scenario, Japan will almost certainly get involved in this conflict, more than just a defensive manner. South Korea is also a major US ally, which too hosts US bases. But the calculus here gets tricky, and that's because of North Korea. A war in Taiwan could lead to a two-front dilemma, especially if China's ally, North Korea, preemptively strikes the South. South Korea would therefore have to keep its forces concentrated on the threat up north, rather than Taiwan. US bases though could still be used logistically to support forces in Taiwan. Mongolia is a country robbed of autonomy. Sandwiched between Russia and China, it would have but little choice to support China. Mongolians heavily rely on these powers and have no capacity to oppose Beijing. The Philippines is a strong ally of the US, extremely close to Taiwan, and would inevitably be drawn into the war. Manila has granted the US its military installations, including sites in northern Luzon, adjacent to Taiwan. American forces would use Philippine bases as launch points for operations, something Beijing would consider a direct threat. Just like in Japan, China could strike these assets, which would mean the Philippines could find itself in direct hostilities with China. These countries are inside the immediate threat zone. They are likely to be involved directly with the war in some capacity, but there is one notable exception, and that's Australia. I made a whole video on how Australia would respond to a potential Taiwan war, so I'll be brief here. You can watch that video if you'd like to learn more about Australia's involvement. Australia is a major ally of the US, but also has a huge stake in keeping the region open and safe. Thousands of US troops are hosted in Darwin, Australia, and would likely be deployed to the strait. Australian subs and surface ships would play a defensive role, keeping critical waterways open and defending the homeland. If spare assets are left, Australia would aid in the battle directly, but long travel times ranging from 5 days up to a week from northern Australia would mean Australia wouldn't be involved in the opening battle. Overall, Australia alongside the Philippines, Japan, and South Korea are the principal allies which would aid Taiwan in some capacity. The rest of Asia wouldn't join the war, but they don't have to still be affected. It's the economic impact which would devastate this region. A Carnegie report cited a source bluntly stating that a Taiwan war would ruin all Southeast Asian economies. These countries aren't wealthy enough to withstand a massive economic downturn. So despite not getting involved in the war, they would still face collateral damage. Countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, Brunei, and Thailand would stay neutral. Singapore, on the other hand, would be a bit different than the rest. Singapore has close security ties with the US, and the US maintains a persistent military presence in Singapore. The country values the rule of law, but has a deep trade relationship with China and also a significant ethnic Chinese population. Diplomatically, Singapore could be one of the few countries in Southeast Asia which criticizes Chinese aggression, albeit in a careful manner. Singapore notably imposed sanctions on Russia, the only Asian country to do so. If China invades Taiwan, it might do so again. Before we move to mainland Southeast Asia, we have to talk about the countries in the Pacific. These small island nations wouldn't be big players like Japan or the Philippines, but as the war progresses, strategic geography suddenly matters more. The second island chain raises the value of airfields and ports. China has significantly swayed these islands to its side, and this is how these Pacific countries lean as of today. And perhaps in the near future, we could see them host forward air and naval operating bases for China. Countries that you've probably never heard of before could turn into headaches for Western governments. Papua New Guinea, however, signed a mutual defense treaty with Australia back in October of last year. And of course, New Zealand, a member of many alliances with Western countries, would do everything short of joining the war to help Taiwan. Vietnam has both a deep and contentious history with China. Currently, relations aren't the best. China claims the South China Sea to itself, overlapping with Vietnam's lawful exclusive economic zone. But this doesn't necessarily mean Vietnam is completely anti-China and on the side of the West. Such a stance would be too dangerous. When you're a neighbor to a great power, strategic neutrality is just a rational choice. Open antagonism is suicidal. If war erupts over Taiwan, Vietnam would be in a conflicted position. On one hand, Vietnam quietly favors anything that checks Chinese expansion. Vietnamese strategists would welcome China being preoccupied and potentially weakened. Militarily, Vietnam would stay out of the fight unless China's actions directly impinge on Vietnam's territory. Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are a different story though. These nations are very closely aligned with China and would likely support Beijing's position. Cambodia and Laos are in many ways effectively client states of China. Cambodia's government could be expected to endorse China's justifications. Myanmar's military junta, which has received backing from China, would also voice support for Beijing's right to uphold sovereignty. None of these countries would likely participate militarily. India's response to a Taiwan war would be shaped by its tensions with China, particularly their border disputes. But this doesn't mean that India will join the war on the side of Taiwan, but rather, troops along the LAC would be placed on high alert. Indian Navy ships would increase their presence in the Indian Ocean, cautioning China. Pakistan, on the other hand, is China's closest partner in South Asia and would firmly support Beijing in this war. Islamabad has a long-standing strategic alliance with China. Militarily, Pakistan could ratchet up tensions with India, but this is extremely risky and could backfire. Pakistan will likely support China's flank, ensuring India is preoccupied with them. The only other country supporting China would be Afghanistan. The Taliban has been courting China and would likely back China's narrative. Smaller countries in South Asia such as Nepal, Bhutan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Maldives would stay neutral, hoping to maintain ties with both China for investments and with the West for trade and aid. Central Asian countries such as Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan have a very strong relationship with China given the Belt and Road Initiative, but also with Russia for security ties. They would support China's position or at least refrain from any criticism. Kazakhstan, for instance, counts China as a top trading partner and wouldn't risk that. They would continue allowing overland trade for China. Essentially, Central Asia would align with the Russia-China axis. Moving to the Middle East, by far China's biggest ally in this region would be Iran. Iran would enthusiastically back China. Tehran's leadership sees China and Russia as partners resisting US influence. In return, China has bought Iranian oil, even under sanctions, and is involved in a 25-year cooperation deal with Iran. When China invades Taiwan, Iran's regime will frame it as China standing up to American imperialism. Militarily, Iran might seek to create distractions for the US in the Middle East. For example, Iran could encourage its proxies in the region, such as Hezbollah in Lebanon or militias in Iraq, to stir up conflicts that tie down US attention. Now, as of making this video in early January, the anti-regime protests are still raging on. The situation here could change very rapidly. The wealthy oil monarchies would likely take an officially neutral stance, carefully avoiding antagonizing China or the US. They have strategic partnerships with the US for security and defense, but in recent years have also built strong ties with China. China is a huge buyer of Gulf oil and gas and a source of investment. If China invades Taiwan, Gulf states would issue general calls for stability and dialogue. Israel would strongly sympathize with the US and Taiwan as fellow democracies under threat. For Israel, a prolonged war would be bad. The more Israel's adversaries would feel emboldened to take advantage of the situation. Other countries, such as Iraq, Syria, or Yemen, might take advantage of a Taiwan crisis by getting aggressive with their own localized conflicts. As these localized conflicts expand, they could evolve into a wider war in the region. Across Africa, China has been making significant gains, swaying various African nations. Over the past 2 decades, China has become Africa's largest trading partner and a major investor in infrastructure. Because of strong economic ties, countries such as Zimbabwe or Sudan could say China has a right to safeguard its unity. A handful of other African countries have good relations with Taiwan, even without formal ties. For example, Somaliland, a self-declared state in Somalia, has a sort of diplomatic office exchange with Taiwan. But these are fringe cases. The major African powers, such as Nigeria, Egypt, and Ethiopia, would likely stick to neutrality. South Africa, for instance, is part of BRICS, with China and Russia, and has edged closer to that camp recently. It's even held joint drills with China and Russia. South Africa's ruling party has ideological links with China's Communist Party, which could color its stance. Nigeria and Kenya, needing Chinese investments and loans, similarly wouldn't rock the boat. One notable exception is Eswatini, formerly Swaziland. Eswatini is the only African nation that formally recognizes Taiwan over the PRC. Europe is generally pro-Taiwan, and a Chinese invasion would be met with shock and condemnation. Having experienced Russia's war in Ukraine, European countries would see a Taiwan conflict as a dangerous parallel, a bigger power using force against a smaller democracy. The European Union and virtually all NATO members would decry China's action and stand with the United States in opposing it. The various European militaries would not get involved in the Taiwan War. NATO's treaty does not cover Asia. Turkey, though, is a special case. A NATO member with an independent streak, Turkey has significant economic ties to China in a complicated relationship with the West. Now we move to China's principal ally, Russia. Without question, Russia would align itself with China in this scenario. President Putin and President Xi have established a no-limits friendship. Just as China sees it beneficial that the US is tied down in Ukraine, so too would Russia if China invaded Taiwan. The difference being, the US would be directly involved in this conflict, making it even better for Russia. If Russia is still at war with Ukraine, or a ceasefire is in place, we could see the Russians resume the war and be much more aggressive. Although China produces most of its own weaponry, it might run short on specific resources, and Russia could fill those gaps. Latin America's reactions would vary. We can divide the region into a few categories: countries with official diplomatic ties to Taiwan, countries governed by leftist governments friendly to China, and the larger economies with balanced relations. Half of the states that recognize Taiwan are in Latin America and include Guatemala, Paraguay, Haiti, and a few others. We can expect strong condemnation from these countries. For instance, Guatemala's president might denounce China's invasion of Taiwan. Paraguay, Taiwan's only South American ally, would likewise decry China's violation of international law. A number of Latin America countries have governments that are ideologically anti-US and have friendly ties with China. These include Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Bolivia. Venezuela's president Nicolas Maduro was captured on January 3rd by the US. Of course, the situation is fluid at the time of writing this, and in the future everything could change. The larger, more mixed orientation countries would likely try to remain neutral and avoid entanglement. They have significant economic ties to both China and the US. Moving to our last region, North America, the United States, although thousands of miles away, has a huge footprint across Asia. Through its various bases in close proximity to Taiwan, the US would respond with immediate and forceful resolve. As Taiwan's unofficial security guarantor, Washington has signaled it would defend Taiwan militarily. Canada, as America's close ally and a fellow democracy, would firmly condemn China's invasion. Canadian naval assets, though limited, might deploy to support US and allied operations in the Pacific. Canada has occasionally sent warships to Asian waters and will likely do so in solidarity. Mexico's reaction would be more cautious. Mexico does not have the same security alliance with Taiwan or the US in Asia, and it maintains important trade relations with China. Given the proximity with the US, however, Mexico would face strong pressure to support the US's official stance. We now know how most countries in the world would react to a war in Taiwan. And a Taiwan war is really a global war, at least economically. The global economy would be devastated. Over 1/5 of global maritime trade passes through the Taiwan Strait, an estimated $2.45 trillion in 2022. That's $109 billion of exports for Australia and around $444 billion for Japan in both exports and imports, and roughly $357 billion for South Korea. China benefits at an even larger scale, $1.3 trillion. Middle East countries send over 30% of exports to Asia through the strait. In Africa, for the DRC, roughly 2/3 of its exports go through the strait, and the whole world really benefits from Taiwan through its outsized role in advanced semiconductors. Taiwan produces more than 90% of the most advanced leading-edge chips. A war over Taiwan would essentially destroy global trade and the semiconductor supply chain. These are the global repercussions of a war over Taiwan. So if China surrounds Taiwan and actually goes through with it, it will truly be a global catastrophe. How do you think your country would react to a war in Taiwan? Would it be different from what I described? I would love to know what you think in the comments below. And if you enjoy this video, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again.